Today on the 21st Show, for nearly 60 years, Chicago-based Cartemquin Films has been making documentaries aimed at fostering a more just and engaged society. Some of its most notable works include Hoop Dreams, which follows two Chicago teenagers pursuing a life in basketball.
He asked me, do I want to be a great player? And I keep saying, yeah. He said, for 4 years, I'm going to be on you every day. So he said, you might as well get used to it now.
We'll talk with Gordon Quinn, one of the founders of Cartemquin, and Patricia Aufderheide, author of a new book on the history and spirit of the studio. I'm Brian Mackey, and that's all coming up today on The 21st Show, which is a production of Illinois Public Media, airing on WILL in Urbana, WUIS in Springfield, WGLT in Normal, WNIJ in Rockford-DeKalb, WVIK in the Quad Cities, and WSIU in Carbondale. But first, news. From Illinois Public Media, this is The 21st Show. I'm Brian Mackey. What was the last documentary you watched? There's been a surge in viewership in the genre. The Center for Media and Social Impact says there's been a tripling of theatrical documentary releases since 2000. And streaming services are full of true crime shows, deep dives into sports, and the likes of Tiger King on Netflix. But before all that, there was Cartemquin Films. Since its founding in 1966, the nonprofit Chicago studio has been producing politically engaged and socially charged documentaries of consequence. It's well known for the critically acclaimed 1994 film Hoop Dreams, about two Chicago high school students and their hopes of becoming professional basketball players. In fact, Hoop Dreams came out 30 years ago this week.
I can't promise you where you're going to go and if you're going to be a star. You're going to get hit, you're going to get knocked down, you're going to get banged around.
You can make something of your life.
That is of an era, isn't it? All right, Cartemquin also produced the 2018 documentary, Minding the Gap, which chronicles the difficult home lives of three teenage friends in Rockford who find solace in skateboarding.
One of the last things I said to my dad was that I hate you.
You can't just have a child and abandon them. Life doesn't work like that.
I just don't want him to grow up like me. I just want to hide. I just want to run away. That's what the drinking is about.
Maybe you're right. Maybe I need to just move on.
I wish you could. I wish that I can do over.
I could seriously be on the verge of having a mental breakdown, but as long as I'm able to go skate, I'm completely fine.
Cartemquin documentaries have earned Peabody Awards, Emmys, Oscar nominations. They've also become closely associated with public television, appearing on shows like Independent Lens, Frontline, and our home station's Real Midwest. Now the Illinois Film Studio and nonprofit is the subject of a new book called Cartemquin Films, Documentaries on the Front Lines of Democracy. It was published last month by the University of California Press. We're joined now by the author, Patricia Aufderheide. She's also a professor of communication studies at American University. Pat, welcome to the 21st Show.
Well, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. Will is truly a huge institution in public broadcasting. It has been a leader and an innovator.
Thank you so much. We're glad to have you. And also with us is filmmaker, director, and literally the man who puts the Quinn in Cartemquin, co-founder Gordon Quinn. Gordon, welcome to the 21st Show to you as well.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
And both our guests are in Urbana today for the Roger Ebert Lecture and Screening. That's happening tonight if you're in the Champaign-Urbana area, 7 p.m. at the Spurlock Museum. All right, Gordon, I want to begin with you. You started Cartemquin with fellow University of Chicago students Jerry Temener and Stan Carter. Take us back to the 1960s. Why did you launch this studio? What stories were you wanting to tell?
Well, I was a student at the University of Chicago. I had done a lot of reading with John Dewey and his work, and I got really excited when I saw some early verite documentaries, Happy Mother's Day by Ricky Leacock and Joyce Chopra, and those films made me think, gee, this kind of storytelling could really play a role in the kind of communication that's important for a democracy, people being able to experience other people's lives and that kind of thing. And so I started learning filmmaking by being an apprentice, by working for other people out in the world. Now they have production at the University of Chicago. When I was there, it was God forbid you do anything with your hands. So that was really the beginning. And we've kind of evolved over the years. There have been many, many changes. And yet those core values of trying to make work that is important to people and that, can have consequences in people's lives.
God forbid you do anything with your hands. You need to spend your time reading people like John Dewey. Talk about the philosophical underpinnings that you mentioned him. I don't think his name is maybe as familiar to modern American listeners as it might once have been.
He was one of the great pragmatist philosophers, American philosopher. And he really had this idea of bringing people together in various kinds of organizations or face-to-face communications around the issues that really affected them. He would call them publics, that these were, people who wanted to do something to make their lives better. And so that's what really excited me about his work. And even today, I think of films, we reach large audiences, we're on public television, there's all kinds of people watching from the Barca Lounger, but those small groups of people that we bring together to watch a film face-to-face to talk about it afterwards is also an incredibly important audience.
Pat Aufderheide, let's fast forward from the founding to today. How would you describe Kartemquin's contributions to nonfiction storytelling?
Kartemquin is an extraordinary example of how documentary can actually speak to the challenges that people face being themselves in this society now. And I think that as documentary has become more and more popular, it has also become more extractive, more exploitative, less ethical. I think there's the rise of true crime is often based on sensationalism and voyeurism. And I think celebrity documentaries often involve real questions about the ability of anybody telling that story to have any distance from the celebrity. And Kartemquin has been there since the 1960s, telling stories about people who are not famous, living crises and challenges that a lot of us face, but often those stories are not highlighted. Just to talk about tonight, we're going to be showing an episode of a series called Hard Earned that is about people who make more than minimum wage but still are struggling to make a living and how they do it. That's a kind of story that is all too rare in any kind of media that we face, and it's very hard to find on many streamers.
Yeah,
Gordon, go ahead.
Go ahead. But it aired on public television, of course. Hard Earned originally.
Hard Earned or aired on Al Jazeera.
Oh, yes, right.
Right. New Americans.
Which no longer, it aired on Al Jazeera America, which no longer exists, and we don't actually own it. And one of my great frustrations is I know that public television would air it and have not been able to get the rights.
I want to put a pin in that because I do want to come back to the changing media landscape and how streaming has affected all of this. But Gordon, I want to go back to the first film you produced for Kartemquin, which was called Home for Life.
Yeah.
It follows the experiences of two people in their first month at a nursing home or assisted living center, we might say today. Tell us what you wanted viewers to take away from that.
Well, one of the things about that film was that we wanted to show the lives of the people, but also the staff, the people who work in the home and what it is that they do and what it is that they accomplish. And, sometimes you make a film and it has consequences you didn't think of. So when the home saw the film, and saw that people were coming into the home and they were saying, oh, we have these facilities and all these medical things, and, here are all of the benefits that you're getting from the home. They were just confusing people. People coming into that kind of facility were mourning what they had lost. They were sometimes coming from family members, maybe they were coming from independent living, but they were giving them all this information way too soon. And when they saw the film, they were like, oh, now we have to really change our policies. And then the film was used in those kind of settings all over the country, as it was also reaching a larger public audience to try to create that discussion of what we were hoping for was how do we treat our older people in America.
So just to reinforce what you just said, I think it's important to realize that the home wanted you to make this film because they understood that they were a good example of this kind of form, and that you weren't there to do an expose. You weren't doing Titicut Follies. You were actually showing an exploration of how it works when it works well.
Yeah, that's really important. And over the years, when we have done things about institutions, we're not coming in to do the expose. We're coming in to say, these are good people, these are caring staff, this is an institution, and yet very often they're failing. So how can they be doing what they're doing better, or should we be asking larger questions? Is this the right kind of institution? But you do an expose, it's kind of like a cheap shot, and say, well, close that place and just, and it doesn't get at the more fundamental questions. When you look at a good institution and you really kind of see what its struggles are, you're getting at the larger societal questions.
So, Brian, what I love so Gordon and I are best friends, and I have benefited from Gordon's deep understanding and knowledge and his profound philosophical commitment to democracy over the years. But here I'm going to say, and this is why I love Gordon, because we can talk like this, I think that there's a real place for investigative documentary, too. I think Belly of the Beast, which was an ITVS film, is great.
Absolutely. Those films are important. We have done some that maybe you would say are like that. Something like Abacus, where we're telling the story of the only bank that was brought up on charges during the great financial meltdown, a small Chinatown community bank, and we show them fighting back.
And if I remember seeing that film, and the subhead was the subtitle was something like "Small Enough to Jail."
Yeah.
It was. In contrast to the bank executives that
the big banks and and so, but by and large, we have tended not to be the expose, but we have been, one of my core values that I share with people, I say, you need to find a way to care about, to like your characters. That doesn't mean you idolize them. That doesn't mean you don't show all of their flaws and contradictions, but those are the films that we really look at making. I mean, we made a film, Jenny Shu made a film here at the University of Illinois about Ying Ying, the young woman who was murdered. And it could have descended into true crime. It could have become a film about the murderer who was aspiring to be a serial killer. And we had all of this footage of him with the police and all that kind of stuff. And even in his therapy sessions at the university. And our real struggle in making the film was to make it about Ying Ying, to make about this young woman whose life was cut short and all that she might have been and her family and who she was. And Jenny Shu, the filmmaker, really struggled to find her way through to tell a very different kind of story about something that you see a lot of all over television. And our film was quite different.
What is the goal of telling that story in that way, as opposed to the Lifetime original movie version?
One of the things I say about true crime is it's packaging people's pain and emotion for entertainment. It has a voyeuristic quality.
And so does the kind of Lifetime sentimentalism.
Yeah.
That's just it's a different version, but it's also an individualistic emotional voyeurism.
And we want to bring people into a story to kind of connect with the consequences of what's happening, so that they as citizens can begin to come together to think about how do we change it. What are the real things we need to do to make our world safer? What are the real things we need to do to make sure that people actually are fairly compensated for the contributions and the work that they make in a society? So it's a different idea, in a sense, from just creating all this raw emotion on the screen that doesn't have you don't see what came before, you don't see what came after, you don't have the information to understand the consequences of what's going on from a social, societal point of view.
Not just emotion, but consequences. All right, let me take a moment to reintroduce our conversation. If you're just joining us, we are talking today about Kartemquin Films, the Chicago-based independent nonprofit film studio, maker of documentary films for nearly 60 years now. We're speaking with one of the founders, Gordon Quinn, as well as Patricia Aufderheide, who is a professor of communication studies at American University and, more to the point for our conversation today, the author of a new book called Kartemquin Films, Documentaries on the Front Lines of Democracy. When we come back, we're going to talk about some of the films. There's actually a screening happening tonight in Urbana, if you happen to be in that part of Illinois. But we're going to talk about The Last Pullman Car. We're going to talk about Hoop Dreams, Minding the Gap, and some of the other works for which Kartemquin is best known. If you want to join us, you can do so at 800-222-9455. That's 800-222-9455. More to come here on the 21st Show. Stay with us. It's the 21st Show. I am Brian Mackey. Quick programming note, you can now listen to our program on YouTube. You can find us by searching for Illinois Public Media. Today we are talking about Kartemquin Films, the great Chicago, Illinois-based documentary film studio, nonprofit. If you want to join us, the number to call is 800-222-9455. That's 800-222-9455. My guests for the hour are a co-founder of Kartemquin, Gordon Quinn, and also Patricia Aufderheide, who's the author of a new book, Kartemquin Films, Documentaries on the Front Lines of Democracy. She's also a professor of communication studies at American University. Again, to join us today, 800-222-9455. Maybe you've seen a documentary recently that changed your perspective or moved you. Maybe you have a question about one of Kartemquin's past films. We got an email from a listener. I'm going to save and ask that in a few minutes here about some of Kartemquin's work. Again, you can join us live at 800-222-9455. All right, Gordon Quinn, I understand one of the films that's going to be screened tonight in Champaign-Urbana is called The Last Pullman Car. We have a clip. Let's listen to that.
With 1,200 members laid off and only 400 working, the union reluctantly called a strike.
And the 400, a lot of them want to go back in. They figure they only got a couple weeks left to work. They're just inviting guys in there. They're going to give them extra pay, all kinds of benefits. They're forcing a division in the union.
Right, it's a scab. They don't want to negotiate any kind of contract. Not 6 months, not a year, but none at all.
Not even a simple extension of the old contract.
They might have future plans on building cars here at these Pullman Standard plants. So therefore, if they can get rid of us in the union, when they decide to build a new cars, they can do it like they want. And screw everybody.
The Last Pullman Car is a documentary from 1983 about efforts by the United Steelworkers to prevent the Pullman Standard Car, a rail car manufacturer, from shutting down operations in Chicago. I do believe one of my great-grandfathers worked for Pullman in Chicago. He would have been deceased by this time, but their plant had opened in the 1860s.
Yep.
Some listeners familiar with Illinois history might know that Pullman's most famous product was, of course, its passenger railroad cars. Gordon, what happened to those workers in Chicago?
Well, you know, the way we got into the project, we had been working in the labor area for a while in the Gary Hammond, you know, the South Chicago area. And we were approached by a group of workers who said, hey, there should be a film about us. We're fighting to save our jobs. We're building the last rail cars in the United States that are, you know, for America. They were building mass transit cars at that point. And they're going to close the plant, and there'll be no more rail cars built in the U.S. And they were getting together with mass transit riders and, you know, other people. They were trying to build a coalition. So we started making this film. They kind of invited us in. We actually had a little film festival in their offices where we showed the workers examples of documentaries, films like Harlan County, so they would have an idea of what we were doing. And as we started getting deeper into the story, what we saw was they're going to lose. The plant is going to close. All these workers are going to lose their jobs, and they're going to wind up in non-union jobs paying, you know, considerably less than what they've been making and with fewer benefits. And so the concept for the film really changed into what you're going to see now, which is we said we have to really look at the history of the rise of, you know, monopoly capitalism and conglomerates in the U.S., the kind of rise of these huge industrial entities, and the rise of industrial unions, the AFL, the CIO, you know. And so we tell the story of the rise of capital and labor by looking at this one plant, by looking at the historic Pullman Corporation and what happened to it as it became part of various conglomerates over the years. And we show the rise of industrial unions and the battles that they fought, and kind of show why they're so weakened as we come into the modern era, so that people who were looking to do something about the consequences of where we are in terms of labor organizing in the U.S. would have the story, would understand the historical context to be able to look at it. And so that's the film, ultimately, that we made and released and eventually was on public television.
And, you know, the thing that's interesting about Last Pullman Car is it's still being used.
Yeah.
It's still being taught. It's actually being consulted by people in labor organizing. And as an academic, it's something that I really love to see as well, because Greg Leroy's research for that project was super important.
Yeah.
And Greg, by the way, has continued, as many Cartemkinites have done in other nonprofit ways. He started a nonprofit called Good Jobs Now.
Yeah, and Greg, when we recruited Greg, he was a historian, to come in and work with us on creating the history. He had been a Pullman porter on Pullman cars with Amtrak. And so he had both this very concrete experience at the same time that he was an academic historian and helped us do the research and made sure, which is very important, that we were getting it right, that we weren't making stupid mistakes.
Absolutely. And also the film does this job of weaving these very human stories and also this larger historical context,
yeah,
so that you can see that to the extent that these people are this project is ultimately doomed because the project is the plant is going to close. You also see that this is not a personal failure. This is a historic. This is a systemic failure. And if we want to do something about the rights of ordinary working people to be able to live well and benefit from their own hard work, people have to be able to organize themselves.
Well, Pat, that raises something in the book, which is this idea of Kartemquin. One of their guiding points is that films have to be with people and not just about them. So talk about that aspect of their work.
So one of the things that has been exciting for me recently is that the field of documentary is, partly because of all the exploitative commercial stuff, been having a conversation that has long been conducted in corridors and back rooms about ethics. And in the ethics conversation, Kartemquin has been a leader for decades in asking what do we owe our audiences and what do we owe the people we're making films with? And that is, of course, related to the fact that they make films about people that they in some way can admire or respect or believe their stories deserve respect to be told. And so the ways in which they have honored those commitments, both to audience and subject, have been many, including they have worked with, Kartemquin's film Hoop Dreams, which was the film that really put Kartemquin on the national map, although it was a regional powerhouse before then. Everybody with a speaking part in that film ultimately benefited from the very big surprise to Kartemquin that this film was lucrative. That is one example, but I also I can see
including
that
a
Gordon,
public television station that benefited from an investment, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
The biggest beneficiary in this story was KTCA, the Minneapolis station, which invested a relatively small amount of money and has been benefiting ever since, including last month, still receiving royalty checks. Yes, absolutely.
One thing I was going to say about The Last Pullman Car is one of my favorite moments in the film is at one of their meetings, an African-American worker gets up and he says, "You mean after all the marches and all the protests and all the coalitions that we form with mass transit riders, and after everything we've done, we're still going to lose our jobs?" And that's the moment, that's the question where it comes out of the people that we're following and we say, okay, we have to answer his question. We have to understand why that's happening to the people in our film. And that's when the whole historical part of the film begins.
Let me remind listeners, this is the 21st show. We're speaking with Gordon Quinn, one of the co-founders of Kartemquin Films, and Patricia Aufderheide, author of a new book called Kartemquin Films, Documentaries on the Front Lines of Democracy. Let's make some radio with people and not just having them listen to us. 800-222-9455. Lynn is calling from Macon County on line 1. And one of our guests mentioned earlier how these films are still used. But Lynn, I think you have some concerns about getting access.
I wanted to mention the economics of, I guess we're talking about exposing and ethics and exposés. The economics of long-term care or of senior housing are two. One is low income, and the other are people that live more at a level of wealth, if you will. Simply put, activities directors in both settings often face rules of engagement that they don't always understand easily. For example, in federal funded settings for low-income senior housing, there may be rules about what kind of content or any of that. Same as with American Healthcare Association. Speaking of monopolies and conglomerates and corporations with human rights and all of that, I'm aware of a senior film group that wanted to show the Canadian documentary that was apparently done as an expose about nursing home reform that was not allowed to be shown at an assisted living because of the nature of the content, obviously, about adequate pay for staff and all kinds of other ethical issues that were being exposed in that documentary. But I guess my takeaway question is, I routinely distribute the patterns flyer out to long-term care settings, and the staff are often, that's the program guide for PBS here at WILL. The staff are often as interested as the residents, and there's a disconnect between not only donor interests and shareholder interests, but the audience interests. The opportunity for not only royalties for films, talk about beneficiaries of films, but the ethics, the exposure that staff may have to thinking of things more deeply than what they're presented with, even in their continuing education, which is an industry that's not nonprofit. Continuing ed as an industry is largely for profit and not concerned with necessarily showing staff what they need to know. But I guess my takeaway question is there a short answer to how do you get licensure to show a film, a documentary in the assisted living? And I'll just park it there. Sorry to
That's all right, Lynn. Thank you so much for calling in. Appreciate it.
That actually, the whole thing that you were saying is a great point, and it reminds me of our struggles with our first film, Home for Life, that we wanted shown in all old age homes. The staff thought the film was great. They said, that's our world, that's our life, that is the reality of what we struggle with. And when we premiered the film at a big fundraiser for the home, the board wanted the film destroyed. They literally said, well, this is not happy people, this is not, and the heads of the home, to their credit, stood up and backed us and fought back and said, this is exactly what we need in our field. But it was a struggle, and sometimes we would kind of circumvent some of the regulations that you're talking about. You find a staff member or you find the activities person, and they're like, oh, can we show your film? They couldn't use their budget for it, but we would let them have the film. So you're really raising an important issue, which is that there are a lot of barriers to getting these films into the very setting where the people who are living with the consequences of the issues that the film are raising are. And so, I don't have a quick and dirty answer to how we get around some of these restrictions.
However, I think that what your caller is raising is very important, which is that all of us are living in situations where we face private censorship all the time. And some of that is because of rules and regulations, as your caller has pointed out. Some of it is financial. Cartemquin has a website, cartemquin.org, and cartemquin.com or cartemquin.org?
It's now cartemquin.org, but either one will take you
Okay,
there.
great. So you can find out the accessibility of all of Cartemquin's films there, but what you will also find is that some of those films are not as accessible as you want them to be. Because of the conditions under which they were made and the investors in them and the limits of commercial distribution. One of the things that faces everybody in public media right now is the streaming environment, and I'm just loving the fact that people will be able to access this on YouTube. But public media has really grappled with how to benefit from the streaming environment without cannibalizing its own relationship with local and regional viewers and listeners. So between the investor issue, the limits, the contractual issues with the distribution site, and the challenges of the streaming environment, we often face genuine obstacles to being able to access the material that hypothetically is so available to us in a rich environment. Let me say that this is why I actually value public broadcasting so much, because it reaches more audiences than any commercial broadcast medium. And if you can manage access to the Passport app for the audiovisual material, which is not as easy as it should be.
I'll let my bosses know.
Yeah.
Well, and I should say
I should pause here. We actually need to take a break. On the we can continue a little of this business side discussion. We have another caller who wants to ask about sort of the flowering of documentary that has in the more modern style, people like Michael Moore in that. We'll come back to that. Please stay on the line. We are talking with Gordon Quinn, co-founder of Kartemquin Films, the great Chicago documentary film studio, and Patricia Aufderheide, author of the book Kartemquin Films, Documentaries on the Front Lines of Democracy. 800-222-9455 to join us. We'll be right back. It's the 21st show. I'm Brian Mackey, and we are talking about Kartemquin Films with Patricia Aufderheide, author of a new book called Kartemquin Films, Documentaries on the Front Lines of Democracy. And she's also a professor at American University in Communication Studies. And we're talking also with one of the co-founders of the great Chicago film studio, Kartemquin Films, Gordon Quinn, who's also a filmmaker himself. If you want to join us today, the number is 800-222-9455. I should mention there's going to be a screening this evening, the Roger Ebert Lecture and Screening. If you happen to be in the Urbana-Champaign area, it's at 7 o'clock at the Spurlock Museum. I want to take another caller now. Chris has been waiting from Urbana on line 2. Chris, thanks for waiting. Thanks for calling in.
Hi, thanks. I just want to say it's really good to hear somebody make reference to John Dewey and his publics. Had a profound influence earlier on, and I'm glad he's alive and well and people are still thinking about him. So I remember in my youth, I saw the Woodstock documentary, and it had obviously very popular, but, they talked to the townspeople, they talked to people from that generation, as well as all the dazzling split screen. And, that kind of stays with me. I mean, and what you mentioned with Dewey was, and the storytelling and democracy, I think that's kind of a good measuring gauge of the success of a documentary. So my question is, how Michael Moore has had a profound influence, I think, on how we think about contemporary issues. Could you discuss him a little bit, his uniqueness and what he does, in terms of like bringing humor and irony, as well as many other things? And I'll hang up and listen.
Thanks. Thanks for the question. I enjoy Michael Moore's films. I'm a fan. We don't make films like his films. When I first met him, I was at a screening of Roger and Me. And after the film, he started talking and he said, I didn't want to make like these boring labor struggle films. I wanted to do something different. And afterwards, I went up and introduced myself and I said, hi, I'm someone who made some of those boring labor films. But I really enjoyed his film. I think that one of the things that's key in a democracy and an open society is that you have all different kinds of storytelling. And I literally, like I sometimes say, oh, good, another Michael Moore film. I really need that. But one of our core values is that we really want to care about the subjects of our films. We want to care about them even though they're flawed. We're going to show all their contradictions. We're not creating a hagiography in any sense. And yet we want the audience to sort of see the struggles of people in their everyday lives with a certain empathetic quality. And I think that one of the things that's threatening that diversity now, something that Pat talked about earlier, is what's happening in the media landscape. When Netflix first came on the scene, their basic business model was, if you want it, we have it. We have everything. They would come to our conferences. They were interested in independent film. They were interested in diversity. When streaming came in, it was all DVDs. They had this huge, gigantic collection. When streaming came in, their business model shifted to saying, we're going to make you want what we're pushing towards you, what we're streaming. And that's a much narrower model, a lot fewer films and a lot fewer things that they're seeking this broad audience for. And so that was a real kind of curtailment to, we all think streaming is great, and it is, but you know, a lot of things are not making it onto a platform unless maybe you've got PBS Passport.
Well, that's the trouble, right? Because we were promised we could access anything from any time in history, and it turns out that if they don't want to pay the rights, or they just feel like promoting their own content, I hate that word, but content, more than something that's important and consequential, then good luck finding it. And there's not discs anymore. Has that affected your business in any way, or your?
Yeah, I love the DVD format and the extras and all of that. And when I was one of the last, my wife actually had, she had been grandfathered in to Netflix's DVD streaming, and we were still getting the DVDs. And when they closed it down, they said, "Oh, tell us what we'll send you a little package of DVDs if you just sign up." So I signed up, and we never got the DVDs.
Right. I just want to say that trying to figure out how to navigate the changing streaming environment is a challenge for everybody. The WGA SAG strike was a really interesting example of the divisions within the industry itself, because the streamers and the broadcasters and cablecasters were at odds in that arrangement. But this is where I also want to tip my hat to Cartemquin's adaptability. Cartemquin has a deal with Hulu to be an incubator for diverse programming, which builds upon Cartemquin's 15-year history now with a program that specifically provides opportunities for people from diverse environments to tell their own stories. And if Cartemquin had not done that cultivation of that kind of storytelling, Hulu could not have benefited, but Cartemquin's diverse storytellers also benefit from Hulu's incubator. And I believe that Hulu was interested in that because it had a very successful experience with Bing's film Minding the Gap.
Minding the Gap, yeah. And
Minding the Gap. And let me actually, we have a caller who wants to just mention Minding the Gap. So
sure.
Wendy from Rockford, thanks for calling in.
Oh, wow.
Thank you. I called mainly to say thank you for creating the opportunity for a young filmmaker like Bing Lau to showcase his prodigious talents in Minding the Gap. I thought it was a wonderful film, and apparently I was joined by the Academy Awards, believing that it was also a wonderful film. So I will get off the line, but thank you for creating that opportunity.
Great, and it's great you're calling in from Rockford, because that is, in a sense, that locality is one of the stars of the film. And Pat referenced the very beginning of our Hulu relationship, and it's important to understand that the first funding for Minding the Gap came from public television, came from public media entities. And when Hulu became excited about it and interested in it, the model that existed was, well, we'll just buy public television out. We'll give them the money and it'll be ours. And we were like, no way, that's not going to happen. And it was a very painful, difficult negotiation down to whose name came first and how the credits were going to read and all of that stuff. But we actually worked it out so that the film could be broadcast on public television and then stream on Hulu. And we got them to cooperate. I hoped it was going to be a model for the future in the industry. That didn't quite work out. But that, it's important to remember that the project began and got its early support from us and from public television.
Yes, and
Sure.
I have to provide a disclaimer here. I'm on the board of ITVS, which funded the film,
Yeah.
but ITVS and POV really were incredibly flexible about making it possible for Bing Liu to get that arrangement with Hulu, which he really wanted, without giving up the credit to public broadcasting. And so I just wanted to also tip my hat to both of those organizations for being flexible.
Yeah, we wanted both audiences.
Sure.
The Hulu also skews a lot younger than PBS, and so we wanted to reach both of those audiences.
And I'm sure that we could probably do an entire hour on the future of digital media and the complications there. I do want to ask, though, Minding the Gap is this film from Rockford. Hoop Dreams, of course, Chicago, the Pullman, the last Pullman car, Chicago-based. Gordon, talk about Illinois and its importance to Kartemquin and that sense of place in the films.
Well, when we began Kartemquin in the 60s, the money was on the East Coast. It was in New York or L.A. or somewhat in San Francisco and Boston. And we thought about moving, and we were like, no, we're Midwesterners. We need regional storytelling in America, and we planted our flag in Chicago. The landscape is very different now in terms of funding, in terms of our ability to connect with national funders like ITVS. But that sense of place, that sense of regionalism has always been important to us. And even when you look at a film that has a national footprint, so we're showing an episode of Hard Earned that was mentioned earlier tonight about low-wage workers. And when you look at the whole series, you'll see, two of the stories, it's like, one's in Washington, and, it looks like it's a national footprint, but in fact, two of the stories are set in the Chicago area. So place matters, region matters. The fact that we are a Midwestern company is all over our work.
Including Stranded by the State, which was premiered by Will and the Peoria station jointly.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite stories. We did that series, Liz Carr, really on her own. I mean, she raised a little bit of money, but she shot it, she edited, and it was when Illinois, with the Republican governor, had no budget for several years. And so people weren't being paid. It was like a nightmare for the consequences that were happening in the state. She did it In These Times, where Pat used to work, and it was a web series. And Moss saw it and said, "Hey, could
Moss
we?"
Moss is the CEO or the director of our home station, Illinois Public Media.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. And he saw the series, and he said, "Hey, can we package that as television programs with our host?" And it was like, well, yeah, sure. That would be wonderful. And then they broadcast it, and it went all over the state. Every little feeder station, every other station in Illinois picked up this show that was so important to an Illinois audience. And given the political divides in America right now, I think that had it come out of Chicago, out of, our Chicago public media station, they wouldn't have picked it up. But it was coming from Will. It was like, that's our world. That's our people. And so we got great carriage, and it was really exciting.
Well, if people want to listen to more from Gordon Quinn and Patricia Aufderheide, there's going to be a screening and discussion tonight, the Roger Ebert Lecture and screening at the Spurlock Museum, 7 p.m. in Champaign-Urbana. Gordon Quinn, founder of Kartemquin, and Patricia Aufderheide, author of the book Kartemquin Films, Documentaries on the Front Lines of Democracy. Thank you both so much for being with us today on the 21st Show.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
That is all the time we have for our show today. Coming up tomorrow, it is our Weeks in Review. We're going to be hearing about news out of Springfield, Illinois. Then in politics, we are going to be talking about some of the ballot referenda that are happening statewide. There are 3 advisory referenda questions. I have had people ask me about this. I know that there are questions out there about that. We're going to talk with a couple of reporters who have done a deep dive on that. Plus, we will hear about a reenactment and annual celebration happening at Fort Massac in South Central Illinois. That is all coming up tomorrow on the 21st Show. You can find us on YouTube now. I mentioned that earlier, but you do that by searching for Illinois Public Media. You can also find us on all the major podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, etc. Visit our website, 21stshow.org, for our email address and voicemail line and all the ways to contact us. The 21st Show is produced by Anna Casey, Christine Hatfield, and Jose Zapata. Our digital producer is Kulsum Khan. Technical direction and engineering comes from Jason Croft and Steve Mork. Reginald Hardwick's our news director. Thanks to everybody who called in today. We really appreciate it. The 21st Show is a production of Illinois Public Media. I'm Brian Mackey. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again tomorrow.